Scott, this attack was targeted at a single airfield, which is believed to have been the location from which the plane that dropped those chemical weapons on that village in Syria took off. This airfield is located about 50 miles due south of the village that was hit by that gas attack. Nearly 60 cruise missiles were launched from ships in the eastern Mediterranean aimed at various locations around the airfield, including hangars and fuel storage areas. And all of those cruise missiles were designed to hit within 1 minute of each other. Now, each cruise missile carries a 1,000-pound warhead. So nearly 60 cruise missiles going off in 60 seconds amounts to 60,000 pounds of explosives in the space of 60 seconds.
David Martin reporting for us from the Pentagon tonight. We also have Michael Morell, the former number 2 at the CIA, joining us, also a CBS News national security analyst. Michael, the President Trump has just ordered an attack against a major ally of Russia. There are many Russian forces, both air forces and ground forces, fighting in Syria. What are some of the complexities that this gets us into?
Scott, I think the key complexity here is we would not want to attack a Syrian target at which there were Russian forces. We would not want to kill Russian forces in such an attack, because that obviously could lead us into a war with Russia. So I'm pretty confident that the Pentagon was confident that there were not Russian forces at this particular airfield.
Michael Morell, former number 2 at the CIA. Michael, thank you. We are expecting to hear from the president a little bit later this evening. He is in Palm Beach, Florida, hosting the president of China in their first meeting. We'll bring that to you as soon as we have it. There'll be more about all of this as well on your late local news on this CBS station, on our 24-hour streaming news service, CBSN, and of course, full details first thing tomorrow on CBS This Morning.
For those of you just joining us, do not worry, the screen is not frozen. We are just waiting for this tape playback to be rolled out, and it is right here.
On Tuesday, Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad launched a horrible chemical weapons attack on innocent civilians. Using a deadly nerve agent, Assad choked out the lives of helpless men, women, and children. It was a slow, brutal death for so many. Even beautiful babies were cruelly murdered in this very barbaric attack. No child of God should ever suffer such horror. Tonight, I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria, from where the chemical attack was launched. It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons. There can be no dispute that Syria used banned chemical weapons, violated its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention, and ignored the urging of the UN Security Council. Years of previous attempts at changing Assad's behavior have all failed, and failed very dramatically. As a result, the refugee crisis continues to deepen, and the region continues to destabilize, threatening the United States and its allies. Tonight I call on all civilized nations to join us in seeking to end the slaughter and bloodshed in Syria, and also end terrorism of all kinds and all types. We ask for God's wisdom as we face the challenge of our very troubled world. We pray for the lives of the wounded and for the souls of those who have passed. And we hope that as long as America stands for justice, then peace and harmony will, in the end, prevail. Good night, and God bless America and the entire world. Thank you.
Legal justice. All right, everyone, that was a tape playback from just moments ago. President Trump announcing the attacks there on Syria, about 60 U.S. cruise missiles. I'm going to show you now the White House. We'll be back in just...
I want to start off by asking you, what exactly now, the same question that I just asked Jessica, if this was a test of this young administration, the Trump administration, President Trump has sent his own message back to Bashar al-Assad with the launching of these missiles, these 50 Tomahawk missiles into Syria. What are the options available to President Assad at this point?
Well, I think what your previous guest, or I think Jessica said, is basically right. President Assad's options are extremely limited at this point. I think what he will be doing is, if not what he will already have been doing earlier today, is speaking fairly urgently with the Russians and trying to figure out what his other options might be going forward. I imagine what we'll start to see from tomorrow morning is a slightly more constructive language from the Russian government on a political level, although of course we will expect them to be pushing back on the military level. I think what's interesting about the targeting of the Al-Shayrat air base, which as far as I'm aware is the only target at the moment that has been attacked tonight, is that it's almost certain that there would have been Russian military personnel at that facility in the very recent past, if not at least earlier today. It would be extremely surprising to me if the U.S. government had not given Russia prior warning that this attack was going to take place. So I expect we will have taken those kinds of prior actions to ensure that this wasn't perceived as an attack against the Russians, but that very specifically this was a punitive measure targeted against the Assad regime for this chemical attack that we saw on Tuesday, and specifically that this was, A, to reinforce the international norm that it's simply unacceptable to use chemical weapons in this modern world that we live in, but also secondarily to force President Bashar al-Assad to basically come back to the table and play ball. The international community has been placing significantly heavy resources into the political process over the last 12 months or so, but repeatedly it's actually been the Assad regime that has spoiled those efforts. I would be very surprised if that wasn't a part of the strategic calculus here, even though, of course, in the immediate term, this is to reinforce the chemical weapons norm that I mentioned first.
Charles, you talk about Russia. Earlier today, a British diplomat who works at the United Nations said there was supposed to be a vote on Russia, a resolution taking place. That vote was delayed. We all know that it would be highly unlikely that Russia would support any sort of efforts against Syria at this point. They're backing Syria. You talk about how it's likely that the Russians got some sort of heads up today. They warned the United States that if there could be negative consequences if Washington takes military action against Syria. What might those negative consequences be, Charles?
Well, the Russians have got certain options on their table. I mean, one of them is, of course, to try and spoil the United States' efforts to take back Raqqa from ISIS. There's been, in a sense, a race for Raqqa between pro-Assad forces backed by Russia and Iran and between US-backed forces, predominantly the Kurdish YPG and its broader Syrian Democratic Forces coalition. It's quite possible we could see Russia trying to accelerate the pro-regime move towards Raqqa in a way as forcing the issue from the United States. Other than that, Russia doesn't have a huge amount of other options that would be logical. Of course, some people will say, well, Russia can start to, directly intensify its attacks on the US-backed or US-vetted opposition forces. I think that's possible, although I think it would actually backfire in terms of Russia's broader strategic interests. Broadly speaking, this is a big test for the theory that escalating certain dynamics within the Syrian conflict will then de-escalate the broader strategic dynamic. And I think we're really going to have to wait to see over the next few days exactly how that plays out. In many respects, of course, clearly Russia is a significant dynamic here. I would actually argue Iran is even more significant. Iran has many, many options on the table in terms of how it will be able to push back against this. Fundamentally speaking, for Iran, the existence and the survival of the Assad regime is zero-sum. It is an existentially important issue for Tehran. For Russia, it's a strategic interest. For Iran, it's everything. And I think this is most certainly where we will see Iran over the next few weeks determinedly start to push back against any further attempts by the United States to exert more influence, not just on the military dynamic, not just on constraining the Assad regime's options, but also, for example, in spoiling any attempts to push the political process forward, in spoiling any potential attempts to push forward the offensives against ISIS, whether that be in eastern Syria or in Raqqa or elsewhere, even next door in Iraq. I would actually expect the more aggressive reaction to come from Iran, although it may take us a few days, if not several weeks, for us to really see that take place.
I would expect to hear much more of this in the coming days from the Assad regime, and Walid al-Muallim is really a master of propaganda, and he learned from the best in the 1960s and 70s from Moscow and East Germany.
All right, I want to also bring in Christopher Harmer, who's joining us right now. Christopher, when we're talking about this situation, what do you worry about next in the coming days when we're talking, especially with the Russians? They're involved in this, so intertwined with Syria. What are you watching from the Russian response?
Yeah, I'm looking for the Russian response. Are they going to accept this, or are they going to retaliate? Now, I don't think the Russians are going to retaliate in any kinetic way. They're certainly not stupid enough to try to engage any U.S. aircraft or ships, but they can make life for us more difficult there. They can use, for example, their surface-to-air missile systems to get a radar lock on our aircraft flying out of Turkey. Now, that's not a provocation per se, but it is an escalation of tension. Pilots do not enjoy getting locked up by fire control radars. I've had it happen to me. It's very unsettling, very destabilizing. That's the kind of thing that the Russians can do to make our life more difficult as we're flying missions into eastern Syria. Now, the Syrian integrated air defense system is at a severe state of material disrepair. 10 years ago, that was a viable system. Today, it simply isn't. What the Russians have done is brought in high technology, very advanced surface-to-air missile systems. They do have some retaliatory options here to go up the escalatory ladder without necessarily engaging in kinetic action. So I'm very interested to see how the Iranians react. I'm very interested to see how the Russians react. I'm very interested to see how Hezbollah reacts. The problem is, as your other guest pointed out, or at least alluded to, this is an extraordinarily complex situation. There's a lot of different people, a lot of different organizations fighting in the same battle space. This is not two-dimensional chess. This is a very complicated situation. So in the short term, yes, I'm glad we retaliated against Assad. I'm glad that he got some punishment for his ongoing use of chemical weapons. I believe that this may deter further use of chemical weapons, but by no means do we know yet what all the fallout from this operation is.
Stand by for just a moment. We are just getting in some video of these U.S. strikes in Syria, along with this statement from the Pentagon spokesman, Captain Jeff Davis, regarding this strike. And we're going to go ahead and play this video for you as I read from this statement. There you see the attack which was launched at the command of President Trump, who authorized this strike on Syria in retaliation for that chemical attack that we saw earlier in the week. This statement from Captain Jeff Davis talks about the strike being conducted using Tomahawk land attack missiles from the destroyers USS Porter and USS Ross in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. A total of 59 missiles targeted aircraft, hardened aircraft shelters, petroleum and logistical storage, ammunition supply bunkers, air defense systems, and radars. Now, this is the statement talking about possible collateral damage here. As always, the U.S. took extraordinary measures to avoid civilian casualties and to comply with the law of armed conflict. Every precaution was taken to execute this strike with minimal risk to personnel at the airfield. This statement goes on to talk about Russian forces were notified in advance of the strike using the established deconfliction line. U.S. military planners took precautions to minimize risk to Russian or Syrian personnel located at the airfield. We are assessing the results of the strike initial indications are that this strike has severely damaged or destroyed Syrian aircraft and support infrastructure and equipment at the Sharat airfield, reducing the Syrian government's ability to deliver chemical weapons. The use of chemical weapons against innocent people will not be tolerated. Charles, let me go to you. It appears, as we are hearing from the Pentagon, steps were taken to mitigate casualties, civilian casualties, as well as Russian or Syrian casualties as well. However, if in fact, say, Russian forces may have been killed as part of this airstrike on this airfield, what would that potentially do in terms of escalating this conflict?
Well, I think if Russian forces were killed, I think it would certainly force Moscow to consider having to respond in some kind of aggressive way. But I think that's precisely why all kinds of various attempts will have been made on the U.S. side to have prevented that kind of a scenario from taking place. I mean, we do know in open source information that this specific airbase has housed Russian helicopters almost ever since Russia intervened in Syria. I don't know if those helicopters were still there when the strikes took place, but certainly I think the Department of Defense has made clear that the cruise missile strikes tonight very specifically did not target a specific area of the base where Russians were known to have operated. But nevertheless, it's pretty clear, and it's been consistently the case for a long time now, that this has been a base shared between the Russian military and the Syrian military. I don't expect any Russians have been killed in this strike, but as I say, if they have, then I think it would force Moscow to respond in some kind of an aggressive fashion, although I agree with some earlier guests who made it very clear that it simply put, Russia would be acting very stupidly and very short-sightedly if it acted directly against the United States. When they come up and match up against each other, I don't think the Russians would come out on top.
Yeah, Christopher, I am amazed at how strongly Putin has been able to keep Russian forces in the air base, in their military, have such a stronghold over Syria. Why do you think it is that he has managed to, in many ways, outmaneuver Western powers?
Yeah, that's a great observation, a great question. The reality is Putin's got an extraordinarily weak hand, but he plays it very strongly. So in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. That's a saying we have in the military. It just says if somebody's got the will to use the force they have, even if it's not enough or not a lot, it's enough if nobody else is going to pay attention to it. Now, in this case, you look at Russia demographically, they're in decline. Economically, they're contracting to a resource extraction economy. Their military is a shell of what it used to be. But because they're aggressive, because they've got strong leadership, and by strong, I don't mean correct or morally aligned. I simply mean the ability to go after what they want. Because they've got a weak hand, but they play it strong, they've been able to have their way in Syria. Now, from the Syrian perspective, the Assad regime is entirely dependent on external support from Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah. So Syria accepts whatever restrictions that Russia places on it. I want to make sure people understand, though, the Russians, the Iranians, and Hezbollah can make our life very difficult. None of those actors can take us on head-to-head and win. That's not an option for them. But they've got a lot of steps on the escalatory ladder that make our life more difficult. For example, the Houthi rebels in Yemen that are essentially a client of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps out of Tehran. They control the approaches on the south end of the Red Sea through the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb. They have been targeting warships there with surface-to-surface missiles. As a client actor of Iran, they can start to put pressure on the U.S. Navy and commercial shipping there. They can put pressure on the Strait of Hormuz. They can put pressure in the Persian Gulf. There's a lot of different things that the Iranians, Hezbollah, and Russia can do short of outright conflict with the United States. So while I welcome this action, I think it was the right move. I think it gives Bashar Assad a necessary punishment and probably a deterrent to further use of chemical weapons. This is the opening act in a very long conflict that's going to play out between Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and the United States now.
Jessica, when we talk about Russia, do you think the counter might be true, that Russia might see this aggressive action and choose not to go forward in any sort of military action?
I think that what has been said by the other guests is generally correct. You know, the Assad regime is not a particularly good or compliant client for the Russians, and things like these chemical attacks actually do a lot to embarrass Russia on the global stage. They're not going to say that publicly, of course, but I suspect that there are some very